Hi, everyone. Welcome to another exciting episode of Retire with Style. I'm Wade Pfau, and I'm joined today by
Alex Murgia.
and Alex. Today, we're going to be changing course a little bit to talk about some other important issues related to implementing your retirement strategies. So, could you maybe level set a little bit and explain in context of what we have been discussing and how that now transitions into what we will be discussing for the next couple episodes in this new story arc?
Yeah. And we're using the word arc because prior to this call, Wade and I were discussing some anime shows, and we were Demon Slayer specifically, and they just finished their Entertainment District arc, and they were going to start their other one. And following cue, we decided to have the same methodology. As we launched the podcast, the main thrust was how you have a retirement income style and how these styles lead to a strategy and your retirement income strategy and how your starting point, for deciding these strategies is that RISA profile. Now that you have this in hand, the next sort of arc that we really want to cover is implementation. And with the same theme of there's many ways to implement a financial plan, a retirement income plan, and which is the way that best fits your style in terms of how you want to implement. And once you've determined that, what are some potential strengths and headwinds that you can play on and play off with regards to implementation? We think that's quite important because everyone can have a plan, right? But if you don't implement, you have nothing but a nice spreadsheet, from that manner.
And Alex, so this is an episode where I think we will rely on you a little bit more because when I went through economics, it was in the transition from the world of always assuming every person was rational and was maximizing their utility subject to their budget constraint. And it was a time that it was just starting to bring in these ideas that no, maybe not everyone is purely rational, or at least they may be constrained in their decision making. And so there may be these behavioral factors that impact their decisions. And I know that you're going through a psychology PhD program. It was, well, I think you never even heard of the term behavioral finance, but really all along you were focusing, or at least you didn't assume everyone was this Spock from the planet Vulcan who was optimizing their decision based on all available information and making perfectly rational choices.
No, that's correct. I mean, I did my program at GW, and they were sort of cognitive behavioral approach with regards to clinical psychology. And interestingly enough, I mean, you're right. I never heard the term behavioral finance at all. It was something that was new to me as I got into the industry. And in fact, I feel like a little bit like Al Pacino in Godfather 3 when I thought I got out of psychology and all of a sudden I'm pulled back in, right? Which incidentally, that's not my favorite Godfather movie at all, but the quote still stands. And it was just one of these things I've never heard of. I thought, when I started listening to these sort of constructs, I thought it was really more like social psychology or even a little bit of industrial organizational psychology. These terms that were beginning to be posited, within at least within the investment management financial planning landscape. And I don't know why this is, but it seems that finance departments and psych departments kind of just had these different tracks, and they just never cross pollinated their respective research agendas for whatever reason, right? People are people, but yeah, these are things that was new to me. In terms of just the terms, the things that they were explaining, like I said, had echoes to me of like social psych and IO psych. But yeah, there's it's interesting in terms of how these things came up, and I don't know. Again, even if you say psychology, there's many schools within psychology. There's psychodynamic, which is more the sometimes a cigar is not just a cigar, kind of vibe where there's these underlying pulls and pulls, and then there's the behaviorist, and even from there you had sort of splinters from there, and there's sort of relational dynamics, approaches as well. But I never viewed it as people being completely rational. From my vantage point, I'm a strong antecedent behavior consequence kind of person, and maladaptive connections were made along the way, for a whole host of reasons. Uh, that being said, as we get into this implementation piece, you really see, this idea around psychological factors and behavior finance factors coming into play. And so as we set the stage for our next arc, what we really want to just lay the groundwork is, what are the 7 sort of psychological behavior finance constructs that we want to examine, and examine them in the sense of how they may affect, retirement income outlook, and how you decide to implement a financial plan once you have that in place. Make sense, Wade?
Yeah, yeah. And so the first of these, and right with that cross pollination between psychology and economics, I was in grad school when Daniel Kahneman won his Nobel Prize. If I'm recalling right, I think that was in 2002. So I got to join up the celebrations around that. But I was so deep with the social security reform research that didn't necessarily always pay very close attention to what was going on there. But Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize he won, was really based in part on this idea of prospect theory and loss aversion, and how people treat gains differently from losses. And so if you can just give us a little more description in terms of these retirement income beliefs and how they ultimately can impact how people implement their strategy. What might loss aversion do to someone that move them away from perhaps the most rational decision making?
Well, ultimately, the big idea here, and it's by big idea, I'm not doing it justice. The foundational idea that really leads to, a whole school of thought, was that, losses are more psychologically impactful than gains. That's a simple kind of statement, but that is infinitely more impactful than the number of words I used to convey that thought. I mean, individuals evaluate gains and losses relative to a reference point. And incidentally, not coming from economics, Wade, this is referred to as prospect theory, because that was a naming convention used because they were juxtaposing it with winning lottery events, and the prospect of winning. They gave it that reference point. And for the longest time, I had trouble just asking anyone, like, why is it called prospect theory? As opposed to just loss aversion. I couldn't for the life of me figure that out. But ultimately, it's this idea that there's asymmetrical dispersions between how you view a loss and how you view a gain. It's not even. Per your Spock comment, it's not an even kind of dispersion where you view a loss, imminently stronger, is significantly more impactful, roughly 2.5 times relative to a gain. And that sort of nuance really begins to quirk your implementation, towards, being more loss averse. Now, this is different than the previous podcast where we discussed loss aversion relative to how you want to pick a strategy, etc. It's more just one of those things that, it is this foundational concept. So we want to just examine, how that may affect how you implement a plan without any preconceived notions behind that. Now, you were talking about Kahneman, his partner Tversky, and again, was talking about this for a few minutes to intro the podcast does not do this justice in the slightest, But one of the things that they did is, they were able to really take a step back and identify decision-making processes. Individuals have 2 approaches to their decision-making. That book, Thinking Fast and Slow. One is predicated on this quick, simple heuristic approach via mental shortcuts, simply because from an evolutionary standpoint, you weren't afforded the opportunity to really sit down and write down the pros and cons of every decision you make. I mean, off the top of my head, there's, hundreds of thousands of decisions you probably make per day, and you don't have that ability to really think things through. I think the 2 and 20 rule really applies to your brain and caloric expenditures, right? The brain is like 2% of your body weight and takes up 20% of the energy. So you really don't have that ability to sit down and think about it. So adaptively, you had to have these mental shortcuts. Now, these mental shortcuts, that's a quick mind. They're very adaptive for making decisions, but they kind of really handicap you when it comes to making good investment financial decisions. And so thinking fast is that quick shortcut versus, that push and pull between the deeply analytical one. Now, what happens is because of this, you're prone to biases. And this is where the behavioral finance literature is just ripe with biases. I mean, they're kind of tailor-made for for memes. I mean, or people love to put posters about, look at the 103 biases that you have, or the 105 biases, or whatnot. But the reality is, there's many well-known biases that can affect you, such as hindsight bias. Sorry, Wade, you were saying something?
Well, and is maybe this is a pop science type view of it, but I've seen like the explanations around when you say people aren't necessarily well, these biases we develop or these heuristics we use to guide our behavior. There may be some evolutionary behind evolution explains, like if you see a snake, you run, or your biases lead you to a quick reaction, thinking fast. You have to make an immediate judgment. And when it comes to a long-term investor, that's where these biases that we have to help us escape danger may not help us with a long-term financial plan, because then if we see a stock market downturn, the natural reaction is to run and panic and sell your stocks. And that's just a basic example of the type of bias that isn't necessarily from an evolutionary perspective. We're not designed to be long-term successful investors, and we have to find ways to counteract that. And that's where this list of biases that we have just speaks to ways that maybe we're thinking in ways that don't help us with long-term financial planning.
Yeah, if you really think about it, I mean, we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years, humans, and we've been adaptive. We've been adapting to our environment. The stock market has been around for a couple hundred years. It's going to take a while. Eat your Snickers and take your time. It's going to be a while for us to be this purely rational player with regards to stock market investing. But I go beyond stock market investing. I mean, general financial decisions. And, some of the ones, the well-known ones, like I said, there's I don't know, it's almost like a hobby to kind of try to identify how many particular curiosities you may have with regards to your thinking. But some of the most common ones are like hindsight bias, right? I should have known that. The sort of armchair quarterback. Recency bias, where you take what's happening right now and you extrapolate that into the future. That's this time it's different. Look, survivorship bias. You tend to remember the losers. The other way around. You tend to remember the winners and minimize the losers. This is hey, don't smoke. It's not healthy for you. Oh, but my uncle lived till he was 90 and he smoked 3 packs a day. It's that kind of vibe. You have gambler's fallacy, you have endowment effect. So there's all of these. We don't want to get into it too much simply because there's plenty of podcasts that can do a much better job that we can at this. And at this point, it's kind of common, what these are. But what we're getting at more importantly is, okay, you have loss aversion and you have that thinking fast, thinking slow. And from thinking fast, there's these mental heuristics that pop up, which are adaptive, but can be quite maladaptive when it comes to personal finance decisions, especially in retirement. And so we're considering these because, again, this is about how you decide to implement advice. And if you're a do-it-yourselfer, then the degree at which you're susceptible to these biases matters a great deal. Now, to be clear about this, everyone has these biases. It's just on a relative basis, how are you relative to others? But make no mistake about it, everyone falls victim to them. And just by knowing them, it's not something you can necessarily avoid. Oh, I know about hindsight bias, so I'm okay now. No, that's not the case. Another piece within the literature that you see that we wanted to examine is this concept of inertia. I mean, there's some folks that will say inertia is actually the granddaddy of them all, as opposed to loss aversion. We're not necessarily into which is the most salient one or anything like that, but it's an interesting concept simply because I think I fall victim to inertia quite a bit on many of my things. I don't know about you, Wade.
There's an element of procrastination, or it's just you keep doing what you've been doing, and though you may need to do something, you may need to write your will or whatever the case may be, but it's just to overcome the hurdle of taking action is complex, and it requires sometimes some sort of external push. It's not always something that can be internally driven, because inertia, you know you need to do something, but to actually do it is a whole nother issue.
Yeah, and so here what you're talking about is forget loss aversion, forget all these biases. It's simply you gotta, nothing to it but to do it, kind of thing. And how do you get this change? How do you change this baseline from the status quo? And literature will show that for there to be a change, you really got to show this improvement. Not just a substitution. It has to be a clear-cut improvement to make this change. And incidentally, this is something that fascinated me in my psychology days. I mean, one of the ways I made my bones was doing health implementation research. During my psychology days, I was just fascinated by what gets people to move into action relative to interventions. And I specifically studied sort of diabetes care, parents and children, and we were part of a community clinic where we were handing out free meds, free sort of intervention methods for parents to apply to their children. And I was just fascinated by the lack of initiative that some parents showed versus the others, and it was just and this is for their children, and where I came out of it, just anecdotally was, it's not that they don't care about the children. It's just that, for their own sake, they wouldn't do this. It's one of these, like, they couldn't get past this push past indifference. It was just one of these things that I just became, like, fascinated about. And I looked at it within the realm of psychology. But you can see this in many ways in everyday financial decision making. Wade said it, but it's true. I mean, we in our sister firm McLean Asset Management, one of the things we do when folks come over is just look at beneficiary designations. Something as simple as beneficiary designations. I mean, getting that wrong, puts you in a world of pain, potentially. And what happens is, their life changes, they get divorced, et cetera, but they don't do the simple stuff like that. And it's not they don't care. To me, I think inertia has a lot to do with this. And Wade, I'm sure in your writings, many things that you're talking about that are best practices, it's not like solving for cold fusion. It's just filling out applications properly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, filling out some paperwork, or finding your password, or finding when you're logged into your brokerage account or your IRA account, or I guess would be more relevant for a beneficiary designation, but finding the specific link where you can go and change your designations. It's something that you could do in 15 minutes if you put your mind to it, but inertia stops you, and
Yeah.
the financial implications of that can be quite significant if, as you're saying, you have an outdated beneficiary designation that no longer reflects your desires.
And no matter how many Geico commercials you see, it just doesn't persuade you to 15 minutes can save you a lot on insurance or whatever. No matter what, you just don't do it. And we see this, why we're bringing this up and why we really want to study this, and will be top of mind in our discussion, is, okay, what did we talk about previously? We talked about retirement income beliefs and how that identifies a starting point. So we want to study, okay, now that you have this starting point, what's keeping you from implementing? Nothing breaks our hearts more, Wade and I, when, a client with McLean Asset Management or through Retirement Researcher, there's a plan in place. Here you go. This is what the plan is, and they want to implement and they want to do it themselves. And it's like, okay, see you later. Ask us if you have any questions. And a year later, they come back to us. Even though we pinged them along the way, a year later they come back to us, and it's effectively, I haven't started. I need help. And it's not that these folks are incompetent. They're actually fairly high-level professionals. It's just this push. It's just hard to explain. It's this push to just keep going, to just move forward. So, it's that difference between also knowing when you need to do something and then doing it. And I think there's a lot of dissonance that goes with that. In terms of knowing you need to do something, it's always in the back of your head, and you can't quite just check that box off for whatever reason. And so that's something that we want to explore. The next one is, number 4, is numeracy. Wade, take it away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and before we started today, Alex thought this episode would be 10 minutes, and we're halfway through our list of these issues at 20 minutes in. But a
Well,
numeracy
it's because I
is...
went into my diabetes research.
You're trying to
I
extend
was trying to pad this baby.
the
No,
length of
no.
our... So this is about numerical concepts like probabilities and probabilistic thinking and recognizing the world as uncertain. Can you understand the likelihood of different outcomes? Do you understand concepts like compounding interest and so forth? It's not necessarily about financial literacy, but it's just more about putting together this basic ability to manage and recognize uncertainty and how different outcomes, a very low probability event, do you put sufficient weight in your thinking on that, or are you putting too much weight on that, and so forth? It's basic numeracy in that regard. It's kind of funny about something we did in our research studies was provide this numeracy questionnaire, and the biggest pushback we got from respondents was if they had a low score on their numeracy, they may not be happy about that. So we backed off in more recent iterations. But
you want to piss people off, ask them about math questions.
And then tell them they got the wrong answers.
It wasn't worth the calories. But no, a distinction though I want to make case here. And here in psychology, I did quite a bit of testing. Intelligence testing and achievement testing, especially with children. And you're trying to develop, what are strengths and weaknesses with regards to academic functioning, et cetera, et cetera. And numeracy, the way we treat it, you can think here is more of a competency test. Why is that? Because you can do financial literacy, but literacy starts asking you, hey, what's the 401k distribution? What's the 401k contribution minimum, maximum? Those kind of things. And those are more Jeopardy related questions that you can just look it up. Frankly, if you were to ask professional advisors a lot of these financial literacy questions with regards to maximums and minimums and things like that, I don't know how they're gonna do. But ultimately, what we're more interested in is how are they as athletes, if you will. Do they have a good ability for numerical concepts? As opposed to financial literacy, which is asking more achievement-oriented questions, which, like I said, in this day and age, you can tap into your external mind and Google it up. So we thought that was quite more interesting. But Wade is 100% correct. I mean, ask somebody about numeracy, and if they get one wrong, man, all of a sudden we sort of, set the test up in our favor. And
that leads to the next one, which is self-awareness.
Wait, was that you kind of pushing me on?
Yeah, let's...
was your internal conversation? Come on, Alex, let's move it along, big guy.
But it was a good segue because people don't like getting the numeracy questions wrong. But there's the term I learned from you, but it's a big term in the psychology world, is this Dunning-Kruger effect, which is about... Those who get more questions wrong tend to they're overconfident about their abilities, versus those who tend to get more questions right might be less confident. They might have predicted that their score was lower than they actually got. And that's perceived numeracy. And again, it's like, if you don't have numeracy, you think you do. But if you do have numeracy, you think you don't.
Yeah, it was...
And that's what this self-awareness is all about.
Yeah, we asked. We did an 8-question numeracy questionnaire, and then we asked them, so how do you think you did? How many did you think you got right or wrong? And we also asked, how did you think you did relative to everyone else, kind of thing. And we term that as perceived numeracy. And our study actually replicated, to the T, the Dunning-Kruger effect. It replicated the original study, which is, as Wade said, the lowest quartile scoring folks thought they did the best. They overestimated themselves the most. The highest quartile score underestimated themselves the most. Part of that is because it's assumed. I can't say for certain, but the highest quartile folks underestimate themselves because they assume that they're kind of normal. They don't assume that they're above average, if you will, to some extent when it comes to this. Whereas the lower folks, the perception was they were math kings, effectively. But this becomes problematic. I think actually this is more problematic than numeracy. Simply because if you're low on numeracy, but if you're high on self-awareness of being low on numeracy, you can find help. Bottom line is you can find help. If you're low on numeracy, but you think you're a genius, then we have problems, right? And again, this goes back to implementation. You have a plan, then you need to implement. And self-awareness is a big blind spot. And so knowing what you don't know is it's terrible. It leads to many things that are not good. And this comes across to us. I mean, it happens. We're in a prospect meeting, and they view what an advisor does as somewhat easy. It's just math that we can put together. What's lacking is, the experience, the wisdom that comes from experience kind of thing. And, there's this sense of, hey, look, I can do this. What do I need you for? And sometimes the answer is you don't. But, in your case, unfortunately, you don't know what you don't know. And that's problematic. And, each of you are in your own profession. And I'm sure when you explain to somebody what you do, there's, every so often somebody comes up and tells you how to do your job better than how tells you how to do your job, and they think they can do it better than you can. And you look at them and you just say, oh, okay, whatever, and you move on. A lot of that is these folks, they could have a host of other issues, but largely they just don't know what they don't know. Wade, do you come across this, or does everyone bow down to the Wade Fowl?
No, it's really, the more you know, the more you realize how little you know.
Yeah.
And so if you don't know, you think you know it. And it's a natural human tendency.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially in our profession. Look, we took this all the way to, we took it as far as we could from an educational standpoint. And all we realized at the end is there's a lot to learn. There's a lot more to learn, at the end of the day.
And so for this next one, self-efficacy, this is where my Dunning-Kruger effect is, or at least I maybe don't have the Dunning-Kruger effect. I realize if I try to explain self-efficacy to a psychologist, it's going to work as well as Alex trying to explain to me how different types of annuities work. So Alex, I might let you handle this one.
Man, Wade, that hurt. Man, that hits deep. That hits deep, Wade. Hey, whoever's listening, don't. Wade's a killer. Wade's a killer. Don't let him fool you. No,
So
self-efficacy. That's a term, and again, these are foundational topics that we're discussing here very briefly. So, apologies in advance. But that's espoused by Albert Bandura, who's one of the greats of psychology. He came at it from social psychology, social cognitive theory, and self-efficacy is the conviction of how well one can successfully execute a specific course of action. All right, that's a big difference between being overconfident. As Wade likes to say, I use this air scenario when discussing longevity concern. Well, I always use this example. Yeah, I view myself as a confident person, but the reality is when it comes to fixing anything around the house, my self-efficacy is at zero. No matter how many YouTube videos I can watch or this or that, I have no delusions of grandeur when it comes to being able to fix anything around the house. My self-efficacy with that specific localized task is pretty much nil. And so my self-efficacy for that is zero, even though I could have, a high overall general level of self-confidence. So you can see how this could apply in retirement income. You can be fairly confident, but how is your self-efficacy with regards to being able to solve, let's say, your retirement income puzzle? And so what we really like to look at here, and what we'll look at and discuss, is specifically retirement income self-efficacy. As much as they say, you should pick a niche professionally, et cetera, when we look at these constructs, we like to be very localized. We don't, so our self-efficacy is specific to retirement income. And that's something we want to explore here, because we do think it does play a role in terms of implementing and how you choose to implement. There's a big difference how someone with low self-efficacy feels about retirement income planning, and someone with high self-efficacy feels about retirement income plan should implement. Do you use somebody? Do you not use somebody? How do you go about doing this? And you layer this in with numeracy, Dunning-Kruger self-awareness with regards to numeracy, inertia, etc., you can see how we can begin to get sort of this nice tapestry of signaling how best someone could best implement their retirement income plan. So that's, we're going to look at that a lot, and that's something that I like. Now, there is another style another factor that somebody could be listening in and say, hey, what about this psychological piece? And I want to talk about locus of control. I feel very strongly locus of control is a big, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, is a big factor here. And locus of control is a construct, espoused by Rotter, in which it looks at, where is the agency coming from for action? And what I mean by agency, that's just a fancy way of saying, who's responsible for this outcome? And, the agent of change, if you will, and locus is a fancy way of saying location. And so with Rotter, he espouses internal agency and external agency. So internal locus of control versus external locus of control. And internal is I'm responsible for this outcome. External is somebody else was responsible for this outcome. Now, this concept has evolved as well. And what happens is external agency is split into two, such as external chance, like it just happened, the misfortune kind of thing, or fortune, or external powerful others. Wade is responsible for my retirement income success, that kind of thing. And this is a very interesting concept that we really wanted to unravel here a little bit. Unfortunately, we tried to create a localized locus of control scale, and we missed. It didn't really capture what we wanted to capture properly. The scale itself wasn't properly done. So, why am I saying this? Well, we just wanted to say this is something that we did look at, but we looked at it ineffectively. But we do think it does play a role. More to follow. It just won't happen here. The last one that we think is quite important is advisor usefulness. And I'll tee this up for Wade. There's many studies that talk about the additive benefits of a financial professional. They call it gamma and so forth. Wade's colleague, David Blanchett, Kaplan, Vanguard has done studies on this with regards to the value that an advisor adds over and above what you could do for yourself. Unfortunately, I think, and this is very valid, and these are very credible studies. I mean, the methodology and so forth, it's sound. There's nothing wrong with them. But I think what happens is when you present these to folks, like prospects or whatever, I think it's easy for somebody, especially if you're somewhat cynical, and you kind of can see why someone is when they're entering these kind of relationships, they just view these studies as sales literature. They don't really buy it. I mean, they'll nod their head and say, oh, wow, this is amazing. But I think in the back of their heads, they're just like, whatever, and they kind of move on. And again, I got to stress, it has nothing to do with the studies. I think the studies, again, are credible and they're sound. It's just consumers are somewhat jaded, so they don't view these things in the same light. Therefore, what we wanted to do is, wait.
Well, now that you've poo-pooed the studies here, so
no.
If there's any point in explaining.
Wait. I think they're actually valid and true. It's just they're not persuasive in terms of getting something. Right. So that's not the angle we want to play from.
Yeah, and just like a little bit more context, like David Blanchett, the Morningstar Gamma concept, that was, well, let's look at a bunch of different financial decisions. Let's look at someone who makes a more naive type of decision around it. How does their retirement play out? Versus if you make the better, more like efficient type decisions, how does the retirement play out? And then showing that good decision making could improve risk-adjusted retirement income by, say, 30%. I think that's one of their headline numbers. And then the implication is, well, if you don't have a financial advisor, you're making the naive decisions. If you do have the financial advisor, you're making the good decisions. And so naturally, right, whether you may be a do-it-yourself investor who says, no, I can make those good decisions. I don't need the financial advisor. And so maybe I don't put a whole lot of weight on that type of result, or the assumption behind that result, which is financial advisors are the ones making those better outcomes happen. The other sort of approach you see is like the Vanguard Alpha. I think Financial Engines has also done a study along these lines. There is a more famous study in this area. I won't even mention it by name because it has a very bad methodology. But the Vanguards and the financial engines and so forth, they're all pretty reasonable. And they look at within their clientele, looking at financial outcomes, portfolio performance for people who are doing it on their own versus people who are working with advisors, and showing that if you have an advisor, you tend to have higher risk adjusted returns from your portfolio. And therefore, again, attributing that to the advisor is saying, well, the advisor is adding this value that if an advisor charges 1% as a fee, but you're getting an investment return that's 2 to 3% higher than you would otherwise be getting, then you're still getting net gains or net value from that relationship. And so the advisor is useful. But again, if you don't necessarily, you think that's more, well, of course, these financial firms are going to have studies showing that working with financial advisors gives you better outcomes. You don't necessarily buy into that a whole lot. And so that's where, like Alex was saying, I don't think you can convince people that financial advisors add value. Like, certainly we do think that for many people, financial advisors can add value. But if that's something you just don't accept, all the convincing in the world isn't going to change your mind. And so how do you view that detail? Do you view a financial advisor as being able to add value beyond their costs? Or do you not view a financial advisor as being able to add value beyond their costs? And again, there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's just your perceptions, and ultimately that will then impact some of this financial implementation, because it's going to speak to whether or not you perceive it being worthwhile to work with a financial advisor.
Yeah,
And
I
Alex.
mean, no, you're right. I mean, we looked at it. That's what we wanted to do. So we created a scale around advisor usefulness, which is not just does an advisor add value, because everyone can say yes, but does he add value relative to the cost of that advice? And that really is, in our view, that hurdle that needs to be jumped if you wanted to implement with an advisor or not. And again, the whole purpose of why we detailed these is going back to the beginning. We really wanted to study, now that we've identified retirement income styles, the RISA profile matrix, and how that leads to a starting point for your retirement income strategy, how do you implement? And so before implementing, Wade and I looked at it, and we came to the conclusion that there's these factors that we want to study, and we wanted to see how they maybe signal certain implementation methods, because just like there's many strategies that are credible, there are various methods and business models to implement a retirement income plan. And in the same philosophy and in that same philosophy, we want to match your implementation approach to the appropriate method. Why? Because we view that if you can match yourself with the right implementation approach that fits you, there's a more likelihood that you'll have a positive retirement outcome. That's really what we want to get at. And and make no mistake about it. Like, if you're a self-directed investor, then our approach isn't to tell you, no, you need an advisor. No, we just wanted to examine, what are the characteristics that really lend for a successful outcome if you're a self-directed investor. Or there's other types, and we'll get into them, in future podcasts. But we really want to get a sense of how these factors play with each other, so we can identify, look, if you're this type of implementer, these are your strengths and these are your weaknesses. If you're that type, these are your strengths, these are your weaknesses. That kind of vibe. And we feel that's a much more productive manner to help you implement financial advice than trying to beat you over the head and tell you, you need an advisor, you need an advisor, you need an advisor. We'd rather just figure out how you want to do it and facilitate that. Now,
Mm-hmm.
wait.
Yeah, so I think, that kind of sums up for today. Stay tuned for more in terms of starting to then implement a strategy based on some of these issues we discussed today.
And you're right, Wade. We literally thought this was going to be like a 10-minute, 15-minute podcast. Yet here we are, 39 minutes in.
Yes.
All right, so
It gave
again,
us a lot of background on the psychology.
well, so it is. All right, so thank you so much. Again, we're going to examine the decisions that help you implement your retirement income plan next. We'll discuss, a couple of very interesting findings from our studies. All right, stay tuned for more. Wade, take us home.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.